Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea forecasting well over 200,000 new cases of COVID-19 on Monday as Omicron continues to spread like wildfire. Despite estimates suggesting new infections could surpass 350,000 a day before too long, the government still loosens social distancing guidelines. A second attempt to evacuate civilians from a key Ukrainian city fails due to Russian shelling, breaking a ceasefire that the two sides agreed to so civilians could evacuate safely. The UN confirms the deaths of more than 360 Ukrainian civilians since the Russian invasion began on February 24th, but warned the real death toll is likely much higher. Plus, South Korea's armed forces and military helicopters dispatched to the nation's eastern coastal regions as wildfires continue to engulf the region after numerous days of them destroying everything in their path. Over 15,000 hectares have been turned to ash already.
Hello and welcome to this Monday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. March 7th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Over the next hour, we will be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea, as well as the rest of the world. However, we are going to begin with the COVID-19 situation in South Korea and the continuing wave of Omicron. The country will see new daily infections easily top 200,000 again on this Monday, and that's a sharp increase from just 1 week ago.
For more on this, we're joined in our studio by Lee Seung-jae. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
So, like always, let's start with the general figures. How many new COVID-19 cases are we expecting today?
So we're expected to see pretty high numbers for a Monday tally. Of course, as of 9 p.m. Sunday, the figure stood at 200,045. Now, it is a decrease of over 31,000 from the day before. But again, considering it's a weekend figure, it is still a sharp rise, and we should expect close to 230,000 for the total daily tally. Now, it's also an increase of 1.5 times the figure reported a week ago and 2.1 times more compared to 2 weeks ago. Now, the big question remains, when will the number of cases in the country peak before we eventually see a downward trend again? Well, looking at the past week, there's been a continuous rise, figures even surpassing 260,000 last week with a 7-day average of 208,000. Now, experts say the country could see figures in the 300,000s before we do reach that very peak.
Now, naturally, high daily infection numbers are one cause for concern. Another deep cause for concern, increasingly so, is the rise in the number of COVID-related deaths.
That's right. So one of the things that we've been watching very closely is the critically ill patients, not to mention the death numbers as well. So if you look at just the Saturday numbers, the country saw 216 deaths from COVID-19. This, of course, the highest figure yet. But over the past week, we've been seeing triple-digit figures almost on a daily basis. Now, from February 27th to March 5th, the total accumulative deaths from COVID-19 stood at 1,013. Now, if you compare that to the figures from 2 weeks ago, 539 deaths. It's almost double the number that we're seeing right now. So if you consider the fact that South Korea exceeded 1,000 total deaths from COVID-19 for the entire pandemic in January 2021, 1,000 a week is a pretty concerning figure. Now, the death toll is mainly occurring amongst the elderly population over the age of 70, but we are seeing more and more younger people succumbing to the virus. So if you take a look at the Saturday numbers once again, among the 216 deaths, 136 were those over 80, accounting for 63%, followed by 44 in their 70s, 21 in their 60s. But we also saw 9 deaths from those in their 50s, 4 in their 40s, 1 in their 30s and 20s. Now, experts do forecast that at the very peak, the daily death toll could be 2 to 3 times higher than it is right now.
But SJ, the South Korean government has eased some social distancing restrictions last week, and this was more specifically by extending hours. Can you tell us more on that?
Right. So there was some concerns as whether or not these ease measures are going to be timely at this time. But you're right. So starting Saturday, the government did ease the elements of the social distancing rules by extending the operating hours of 12 kinds of multi-use facilities. This, of course, including cafes and restaurants by 1 hour to 11 p.m. in order to better support these small merchants. Now, the new curfew will be effective until March 20th, while the current 6-person cap on private gatherings will remain in place. Now, many small business owners welcome the news. However, some say, well, it's not enough.
It's better than nothing, but there are still a lot of complaints. Many drinking and entertainment venues still find it more difficult to do business.
That's right. Of course, citizens have also voiced their concerns as well, especially because the daily figures have yet to peak, with many of the children still unvaccinated. They're fearing that with the extended business hour, the infection numbers will continue to soar as well.
Yes, that's a cause for concern, but going into effect from this Monday as well, there is going to be a new exception to those who have to submit negative PCR tests if they are newly arriving in Korea from another country.
That's right. So despite the fact that we are seeing these soaring numbers, we are seeing more and more of the easing of some of these restrictions. So like you said, starting today, inbound Koreans who have been treated for COVID-19 10 to 40 days before departure will not have to submit a negative PCR test before arrival or even before boarding the plane. Now, instead, they can submit documentation that shows the date of COVID-19 infection. Of course, prior to this, from last July, the government made it mandatory for all inbound travelers to submit a negative test when, of course, entering the country.
Now, we're just 2 days away from South Korea's presidential elections, and the government also plans to, improve ways for COVID-19 patients to cast their ballots.
Right. So certainly unprecedented right now, all the things that are happening at this time, because there were some issues during the early voting for people isolated or infected on Saturday. Now, with the high number of patients in quarantine, many took to the polling stations early only to find themselves waiting in long lines in the cold. Now, that's because the outdoor temporary voting booths where the confirmed patients could vote were not announced in advance, meaning voters were unsure where to go and had to wait in the cold with fears of their symptoms could worsen. Now, health authorities did say that they will look into ways to reduce the waiting time for the voters after collecting opinions from different people.
All right, we'll have to see what kind of changes we're expecting for Election Day. SJ, thank you so much for your efforts today.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the other big news of the day, this international news. However, over 1.5 million refugees from Ukraine have crossed over into varying neighboring countries since February 24th, when Russia launched its invasion of their country.
The UN's Refugee Agency is already labeling it as the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. Kim Hyo-san reports.
The number of Ukrainians fleeing the war to neighboring countries has swelled to 1.5 million in just 10 days. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, it's now the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. The UN added the civilian death toll since Russia launched its invasion against Ukraine on February 24th stands at 364. This, it said, includes over 20 children, adding hundreds more have been wounded. Amid the hostilities, Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly told his French counterpart Sunday that Moscow plans to achieve its aims in Ukraine through either diplomatic or military means. According to an unnamed French official, Putin seems very determined to achieve his objectives, including on what the Russian president again calls the, quote, denazification and neutralization of Ukraine. During a call with Turkey's president on Sunday, Putin also explained that Russia's military campaign in Ukraine is going to plan and will not end until Ukraine puts down its arms. Meanwhile, the head of European Council is insisting that imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine would eventually trigger a full-fledged world war and is therefore not under consideration. The comments coming a day after Ukraine asked the West to establish a no-fly zone over the country. The U.S. says it's in active discussions with its European allies to ban Russian oil imports as part of further economic penalties on Moscow. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said in an interview Sunday that discussions are underway while the U.S. tries to maintain a steady global supply of oil. Blinken also said the U.S. is working actively on a deal with Poland to supply Ukraine with jets. The deal could involve the U.S. providing F-16 fighters to Poland as replacements once the Poles hand over their fighter jets to Ukraine. Against this backdrop on Monday, delegations from Ukraine and Russia will reportedly hold a third round of negotiations. However, no details yet on where the talks will take place. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine prompted a wave of unprecedented international sanctions on Russia, as well as on Kremlin officials and wealthy Russian businessmen. But these restrictions are not only expected to affect Russia, but South Korean firms with operations there as well. Our Song Yu-jin with the details.
With the international community slapping sanctions on Russia, South Korean companies involved in trade with the country are likely to also be affected. To start off, a total of 151 South Korean companies are currently doing business in Russia. Out of the 151 companies, 16 conglomerates manage 53 corporate bodies across Russia. Hyundai Motor Group have the most entities with 18, followed by Samsung and Lotte. In terms of location, the capital Moscow is where most South Korean companies, including LG Electronics, Samsung Electronics, Orion Manufacturing, and Uri Bank are located. Next is St. Petersburg, which is home to local representatives of Hyundai Motor, Hyundai Steel, and Lotte Hotel. In terms of sector, manufacturing makes up more than half of South Korea's foreign direct investment to Russia, with 59.5%. Car production takes up the highest proportion of the sector, followed by pharmaceuticals and food.
A lot of South Korean firms who have manufacturing companies within Russia are having a hard time. They lack a smooth supply of parts, and even if they sell their products in Russia, transactions are made with a now collapsed ruble.
Alarm bells are also ringing for South Korean trade. As of last year, Russia was South Korea's 10th largest trading partner, accounting for 1.6% of total exports and 2.8% of imports. In terms of exports, automobile and auto parts were highest with 40.6%. More than 70% of imports from Russia came from the energy sector. In the near future, South Korea and Russia's trade in terms of auto parts and cosmetics is expected to be disrupted with a surge in raw material prices and a shortage of rare gas types like krypton used for semiconductors, adding more concern. Experts say South Korean firms will have a hard time for a while, with the international community imposing stricter economic curbs on Moscow, such as expelling it from the SWIFT banking system. Song Yu-jin, Arirang News.
South Korean authorities have spent the night exerting every effort to try and prevent a massive wildfire from spreading in the country's eastern coastal areas. Firefighting helicopters have been deployed to the area. The wildfires had burned over 15,000 hectares of forest as of Sunday afternoon. That's equivalent to 53 times the size of Seoul's Yeouido financial district. More than 7,300 people have been evacuated, but fortunately no casualties have been reported. President Moon Jae-in has declared the worst affected areas of Uljin in Gyeongsang-Bukdo province and Samcheok, Gangwon-do province as special disaster zones so they can receive targeted emergency support. Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. South Korea's daily new COVID-19 cases have been around the 200,000 to 250,000 mark for a few days straight now, as Omicron continues to just rip through the population. On Monday, the cumulative number of cases since the virus arrived on these shores is almost certainly going to top 4.5 million, which is considerable considering the population is only around 50 million. While Omicron is generally seen as less dangerous than previous strains, the number of critically ill patients and deaths, as we heard from our Eastern J before, is rising.
Despite this, the government loosened social distancing guidelines yet again last Friday. Businesses welcomed the extension of operation hours, but a number of experts have expressed concern that it's happening too fast. For more on where we stand, we connect to Dr. Alice Tan, internist at mismanagement Women's Hospital in Seoul. Good morning, Dr. Tan.
Good morning.
So firstly, like we said, we're seeing huge numbers of infections and deaths have been setting new records and ICU admissions are up. But despite this, distancing restrictions have been loosened. So what do you think about the move? And do you expect the government to bring back the restrictions after Wednesday's presidential election?
Well, in terms of the expanded business hours, there's actually two directions that we could see an influence of this change. First of all, because hours have been expanded, this could actually decrease the amount of crowding in indoor spaces, just because the amount of time that people are allowed to gather has been expanded. On the other hand, of course, obviously, there are more opportunities now for people to mix and gather without a mask on, and that could increase the chance of transmission. Overall, the government has said that perhaps this change could influence the numbers by about 10%. That was the estimate in terms of the influence on caseloads. So we will have to see. In terms of what kind of changes we can anticipate after the election, it's unclear right now, of course. But what I would like to see is a document similar to what has been released by the U.S. White House. They recently released a national COVID-19 preparedness plan. It's a 97-page document that outlines how the country is going to protect people against COVID, prevent the infection, treat the infection, how they're going to make sure that there's enough stockpiles of PPE and therapeutics, how they're going to help vaccinate the world against COVID-19, and also to prepare against variants. I would like to see a similar document prepared by our government here in Korea after the election. I mean, we don't have to wait until after the election, but obviously we may have a new administration. And I think that's one of the first things that needs to happen.
Now, Doctor, critics have said that many of the current policies in regards to restrictions could potentially be aimed at trying to shift the political mood in the country. Some polls showing that the majority of South Koreans are just keen for some kind of change after 5 years of this current government. Are you concerned, though, that such political considerations may be coming before national health considerations?
Well, in the current issue, the March issue of the medical journal Emerging Infectious Diseases that's published by the US CDC, the Korean CDC, so the KDCA, actually published an article stating that an effective package of measures, public health measures, would be necessary to mitigate the spread of the Omicron variant. I haven't seen an effective package employed by our government to prevent the spread of Omicron. And so I wonder what's going on. Our public health officials clearly stated the need for an effective package, and yet what we've done is eased measures, public health and social restrictions, sort of gone in the opposite direction. I understand that part of this motivation was to help promote the economy. Also, hospital capacity still remains relatively open. So 56% of ICU beds, 61% of subacute ICU beds are still open. And so I think that's what motivated this change. But you never want to wait until 70% of your ICUs are filled because we already have enough high-risk patients diagnosed to fill these beds. Even now, the numbers are so high. So if we wait until 70% or more are filled before we pull back, then we risk having the same situation as we were during our last wave, where ICUs are completely filled and people end up dying before they can be admitted to the appropriate facilities.
But Dr. Tan, like we said a while ago, we are expecting some changes for Election Day. But what is your medical opinion on allowing COVID-19 positive people being permitted to leave the house to vote? Polling stations let them vote for 1 hour starting at 5 p.m. on Saturday during the early voting period. So do you expect this could lead to further spike in the coming days?
Certainly there's a chance of transmission. Anyone who has the highly transmissible Omicron strain could spread the infection very easily. But I think what this issue highlights is, first of all, just how many active COVID patients we have in our country. We have more than 1,100,000 active cases in our country. And certainly this type of population could affect the outcome of a presidential election. And so we really do need to allow these people to vote. I think the other issue that's highlighted is that we don't have a non-contact option for these people to vote. We don't have mail-in voting. We don't have online voting available, which would have been preferable. And I think it's also more concerning to me is that people who have positive rapid antigen test results before their PCR test results are available, they're allowed to vote with everybody else. They're not getting the separate time slot to vote. They're being allowed to stand in line with uninfected people who could be of high risk. And that's actually more concerning to me.
Yeah, it just makes you wonder why this couldn't have been sorted out weeks, if not months in advance, considering that the situation was hardly likely to get much better over the course of this time. And having people standing outside for hours on end in the cold isn't going to do much good. But finally, most of the projections are now saying that cases might top out at around 350,000 new cases a day, which would be huge numbers, of course, in a country Korea's size, before they start plateauing out like they have in many other countries. Do you expect this forecast to be fairly accurate? And I also want to touch upon the impact that, so if we have 4.5 million people so far, we don't know how many people eventually are going to have had COVID. What kind of impact do you think this could potentially have on the healthcare system if even 1%, 2%, or 3% of those have long COVID?
Those are really great questions. First of all, in terms of the trajectory right now, one of the metrics that we use to predict where we're heading in terms of the epidemic curve is test positivity. And our test positivity is still very high. It's above 40%. And until this number starts to decrease, we can't really say that we're beyond the peak. The other thing to keep in mind is we still seem to be in the acceleration phase in terms of adding 1 million new cumulative cases. We've gone from, it took 2 years to get to the first million cases on February 5th. Then it took 15 days to add another million cases, February 20th, 7 days to reach 3 million on February 27th, and then 6 days to reach 4 million on March 5th. So we're certainly still in the acceleration phase. In terms of long COVID, the impact will be huge. It's not 1% to 2%. It's more 10 to 30% of the population may have some form of long COVID. And it's not just symptoms, right, that we're concerned about. It's about the impact on increased numbers of people who have cardiovascular disease, neuropsychiatric issues, diabetes, and not just across the adult population, but also among the pediatric population. These are children who may have to live with these chronic diseases for decades. And so the impact will likely be huge. And I'd like to be able to talk about this more. What are we going to do to mitigate this impact, because surely it's going to have an impact not just on healthcare cost burden, decreased productivity, perhaps even decreased life expectancy. And this is something that we need to talk about and prepare for.
All right. Dr. Tan, as always, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Now to the presidential elections. The candidates in the running for Korea's presidential election Wednesday are reaching the tail end of their campaigns. The ruling Democratic Party of Korea's candidate, Lee Jae-myung, was campaigning in Seoul on Sunday, trying to rally as much support as he can in what is one of the most fiercely contested regions. He pledged to bring down the skyrocketing home prices and create more opportunities for young people. Kim Do-yeon reports.
The ruling Democratic Party of Korea's presidential candidate, Lee Jae-myung, is focusing on winning support in one of the regions where the race will be the tightest in this election, Seoul. With 6 rallies on Sunday in busy areas of the capital, his first main topic was one of the election's biggest issues, the people unable to afford a home because of runaway prices.
The transaction system is going to change without a doubt, in a way that supports one house for one family. For me too, one house is all I have, but it's the country's responsibility to respect the dream of home ownership and to make it possible.
He also said transportation will improve for many Seoul residents as he plans to extend train lines connecting the city proper with the rest of the capital region. Here in Seongbuk-gu District, Lee Jae-myung claimed that the north side of the city has been left behind in many development plans. He said that using his experience as the governor of the surrounding province, he will make sure the development projects are distributed fairly. Another topic of his speeches throughout the day was helping the country's struggling young adults as he stopped in neighborhoods near college campuses, such as Sinchon. He said it's the fault of the older generation, including himself, that young people have fewer opportunities to achieve a comfortable life.
Not a country where young people are divided by gender and fighting, but an affluent country with lots of opportunities, where people can compete cooperatively, take on bold challenges, and get back up even after a failure.
He promised policies to provide young adults with more opportunities, including law schools held online and through night classes. He also said he will invest more into arts and culture so that young adults can use their creativity to the fullest. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the candidate for the main opposition People Power Party, Yoon also campaigned in Seoul on Sunday. He addressed claims of mismanagement during last weekend's 2-day early voting period and, like his main rival, discussed what he and his Conservative Party would do to bring down housing prices. Lee Kyung-in with the details.
In his first campaign speech of the day on Sunday, Yoon of the main opposition People Power Party addressed mounting concerns about the mismanagement of early voting the day before for those infected with COVID-19. There have been reports of officials using unauthorized ballot boxes and claims that some ballots were already marked for Lee Jae-myung of the ruling Democratic Party.
Our party is investigating, but I think it's an attempt to fuel division among conservative voters who've traditionally held doubts about early voting due to the potential for fraud.
Yoon is currently neck and neck in the polls with Lee Jae-myung, raising the stakes of each vote. Yoon said in his speech, if we vote, we win. If we don't, we lose, calling for active participation to prevent any boycott of the vote over fears of potential electoral fraud.
It's Yoon Suk-yeol's second consecutive day in the battleground capital region, and Yoon also addressed the skyrocketing housing prices, the biggest concern among South Koreans according to polls in the area hit hardest by the very issue.
He also pointed to the higher taxes people are having to pay because of rising home values, which he blamed on the current government and channeled into his call for a change of government.
Because of soaring housing prices, homeowners have to pay so much more tax. Our retirees pay more for public health insurance. And for young adults, buying a home is something they can scarcely dream of.
In the meantime, Yoon could visit Seoul once again for the finale on the last campaigning day on Tuesday. And he could hold another joint rally with An Chul-soo of the People's Party, now withdrawn from the race, to highlight the united front among his and An supporters ahead of Election Day. 이경은, Arirang News.
Now, with just a couple more days of official campaigning left for South Korea's presidential candidates, the frontrunners are making their final pushes toward the finish line. The ruling Democratic Party of Korea's candidate Lee Jae-myung starts his day on the southern resort island of Jeju before heading north, stopping in the cities of Busan, Daegu, Daejeon and Cheongju. The main opposition People Power Party's candidate Yoon Suk-yeol will be rallying in his rival's political home turf, Gyeonggi-do province. In fact, he'll be hitting 8 different cities in the country's most populous province on Monday alone. The candidate for the minor Progressive Justice Party, Shim Sang-jong, will be in the capital region with rallies in Gyeonggi-do province before ending her day in Seoul's Guro-gu district.
And now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has entered its 11th day, and shelling from both sides has continued to take place, breaking a temporary ceasefire in the southeastern port for the second time and compromising the safety of evacuees fleeing the war. The number of people escaping the country reached 1.5 million just 10 days after the Russian forces invaded, and that's according to Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. There's now growing dread that the war could stretch on for months and even years, according to UK Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab and French President Emmanuel Macron, following a 2-hour phone call with the Russian president on Sunday, concluded that Vladimir Putin intends to go all the way to denazify Ukraine. We discussed these latest developments today with Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be with you. Thank you.
Well, Dr. O'Hanlon, now there are reports that Russian attempts to take Kiev have stalled in recent days after facing strong resistance from Ukrainian forces. And well, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he said that Ukraine can absolutely win the war against Russia and that the war has already not gone as Vladimir Putin might have planned. So what was Mr. Putin's original plan, and what do you think he's grinding towards failure with this war?
You know, it's a hard question. I think that he believed he had such a psychological advantage that he had been successful in previous military interventions on a small scale in Crimea in 2014 and in Syria in 2015. He, I think, is a strong Russian chauvinist and nationalist who is probably rather arrogant about his own abilities and his own country's. And he probably thought that just like the Taliban intimidated the Afghan government into essentially surrendering last summer, that he could intimidate the Ukrainian government and people into surrendering now. That's my best guess. But, you know, to be fair to President Putin, whom I do not like, and I'm not really trying to be fair, but let's bear in mind that many people historically have done the same thing. And the United States, when we intervened in Iraq in 2003, many people thought that would be easy. And it turned out it was not. And if you go back even to the Korean War, obviously the North Koreans did very well in the opening weeks of the war. And then the United States and the Republic of Korea did very well in the next few months in the fall of 1950. And then the Chinese intervened. So in war, things often happen in a very unpredictable way. And you know, sometimes people get a sense of overconfidence because they have a theory of how to win that seems pretty smart or clever, or the initial start to the war goes well. But they forget to account for the fact that adversaries will adapt and that people will fight hard when their own lives and their homelands are on the line.
And well, apparently the Russian president told his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, that demilitarization and denazification, as he said, of Ukraine would be achieved no matter what. Do you think that means that he's willing to use nuclear weapons?
Well, first of all, this language of President Putin is abysmal and horrible, and none of us should be in any way lenient or tolerant of this language. The idea that somehow a Jewish president of a Ukrainian state that fought every bit as hard against the Nazis as did Russia should be labeled a Nazi is absolutely absurd. And it goes to show the degree to which President Putin is completely committed to lying to the world community and to his own people in order to create a psychological climate. Now, I don't really think that means he wants to use nuclear weapons. President Putin is, I think, a bad guy, but I do not think he's crazy. I do not think that he wishes his own country's destruction or his own personal destruction. And he knows that if he were to use nuclear weapons to try to keep attacking further into Europe, there would have to be a retaliation by the United States and other countries in NATO. So what I think he is saying really with the nuclear threat is simply do not think about intervening in this war in Ukraine, because if you do, President Putin, may be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend my own military inside of Ukraine. And on that point, I think he may well be serious, but I don't think he has to worry about that because we're not going to intervene in Ukraine. President Biden's been very clear, and I agree with President Biden on that point. So my own assessment would be that the nuclear threat is really just designed to make sure that NATO does not enter this war as it's currently going on.
Well, Ukrainians have been fighting back for over 10 days now, entering its 11th day of war, but can they continue to put up such a strong resistance?
It's going to be hard for the Ukrainians to keep this up in the sense that their country is being squeezed so dramatically. And the Russians, of course, control much of the road network, much of the rail network. There's no air traffic to speak of. You know, the country, if nothing else, is being just compressed and cut off economically, with the only real border being to the west, the only way that things can get in and out of Ukraine. And that's going to make it very hard for the Ukrainians to persist or to win the war. However, the Russians only have a few roads they can really use to bring in their armor. It's a tough time of year to fight in the cold, snowy, and soon-to-be muddy fields of the Korean Peninsula, like the Korean Peninsula, of the Russian steppe and the Ukrainian steppe. And I think this is just not a good place to want to wage armored combat. And you're stuck on the roads where the enemy knows how to attack you and how to slow you down. And the Ukrainians do have a lot of good anti-tank weapons. They have other ways to barricade the roads. So Russia may be stuck in some parts of the country for a very long time. Unfortunately, it can continue to pound away at Ukraine cities and cut off economic activity in Ukraine. So I think it will gradually strangle Ukraine, even if it's not able to conquer it in a direct physical, geographic sense.
Well, the US and its allies have been imposing sanctions on Russia, of course. And well, in response to this, Vladimir Putin warned that sanctions from the West are akin to a declaration of war. Now, does this indicate to you that the sanctions are working? And well, what other measures is the US preparing to take?
Well, you're right. That is an indication, I think, that Putin sees the sanctions as extremely serious and that he is claiming that we somehow are fighting him already, which, of course, we're not. And I don't know how he can expect the world to trade with a country and with a president who is nakedly aggressing against another nation right across its border. So I think President Putin better get used to this kind of treatment, because if he continues to attack Ukraine, the economic sanctions will only get worse. And, it may take us a while to develop alternative oil and gas supplies for Western Europe in particular. But I actually think the sanctions will get even stronger if Putin continues the war. And we're not going to be persuaded to stop them just because he doesn't like them. There's a very simple thing for him to do if he doesn't like the sanctions, and that's stop attacking Ukraine and pull his forces home.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he warned that if the West does not increase military aid, then Russia would then advance on the rest of Europe. Do you think that the world should be prepared for such a scenario?
I think Vladimir Putin's most ambitious goal would be to restore a single country that holds most or all of the world's Russian-speaking individuals and communities. So, no, I do not think he would attack Poland. I do not think he would attack even Lithuania, although I suppose he might, in some ambitious sense, want to get all the Baltic states back. But he would probably like to get back parts of Estonia and Latvia, where there are a lot of Russian-speaking individuals. And I think he certainly is tempted to take all of Ukraine, not only to defeat Ukraine militarily, but then to make Ukraine part of Russia, to essentially eliminate Ukraine, to annex Ukraine or most of it. And that would accomplish most of his goal of reunifying all Russian-speaking peoples under his single and Moscow's single direction. Of course, most of the people he wants to reunify do not want to be reunified with him, but he's not giving them that choice. He is attacking. He has this vision of a grandiose, grand Russia that, again, is not going to extend, even in his best ambitions, as far as the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact. But I think there's a possibility that he could attack in the Baltic states.
Well, nobody can be sure exactly what's running through Vladimir Putin's mind, of course, and there have been questions about his mental health as well. But do you think it really is the revival of the Soviet Union that he's really envisioning, or revenge on America as something?
Well, I think he does want revenge on the United States and NATO. I think he feels that we have offended him by expanding NATO to the east, and also by trying to get other people elected in Russia besides he himself, also by trying to encourage democracy as we define it in Ukraine and Georgia. And he does have a lot of resentment against the United States, and he has a lot of resentment against President Zelensky of Ukraine. So I do think that anger and a sense of betrayal are part of what motivates him. But I don't think he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union for the reason I just mentioned. He really thinks much more about Russia than about the Soviet Union. He has a very nostalgic and romantic view of Russia, and he would like Russian speakers to all be under one common country and ruled by Moscow. But I do not believe there's any evidence for an idea that Vladimir Putin wants to conquer the former Warsaw Pact countries or even necessarily all of the former Soviet Union. But he would like to control peoples that are Russian-speaking or strongly linked to Russia historically or share a strong language with Russia. And of course, that means many, many Ukrainians.
Well, the UK Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, has said that he thinks that this war could go on for months and even years. What's your projection?
I agree. I think to me, this looks like Russia's equivalent of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, or maybe Russia's equivalent of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It does not look like the Soviet invasion of Hungary or Czechoslovakia. Both of those operations were much quicker and easier in the 1950s and 1960s. This has the potential to end in the next few weeks, but it also has the potential to continue for many months. And even once it is over, so to speak, I'm not really sure it will be over, because Ukrainian resistance might continue at some level. And certainly the world will continue to punish Vladimir Putin economically and punish Russia with sanctions, even stronger than the ones that are in place today, even if the fighting largely ends. So I think Vladimir Putin's made a huge mistake, and he's got to look for a way now to find some kind of a negotiated way out. And I think we should be trying to help. I've got some ideas on how we can try to encourage a little bit of flexibility by President Zelensky, because the alternative is so bad.
That was Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research and Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Biden administration has finalized a regulation to increase the proportion of U.S.-produced parts that need to be used in products in order for them to be considered made in America. According to the regulation that was announced Sunday, starting October 25th, in order to be recognized as being made in America, the proportion of parts produced in the U.S. need to account for more than 60% of a product, up from the previous 55%. The move is part of amendments made to the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The proportion will be increased to 65% in 2024 and 75% in 2029. The White House says it wants to create more opportunities for small businesses as well as disadvantaged members of society.
Now, despite the rising number of them on sale and the growing number of enthusiasts, there aren't too many drones flying overhead in South Korea these days, but experts believe Such an era is fast approaching, whether we like it or not. Han Sang-yu visited one of South Korea's leading research teams to hear more about the latest innovations in drone technology.
Imagine autonomous drones replacing first responders dispatched to disaster zones who risk their lives saving others in the line of duty. Such high-tech machines would have access to buildings on the brink of collapse and be able to navigate indoors, an innovation that's captivated one of Korea's leading drone labs.
Recently in Korea, there was the apartment building collapsed, right? They had some accidents. So these drones also have the camera like here. So this camera can tell, and these days, thanks to the AI, it can detect the objects. So if you are looking for some human victims, then we can recognize a human shape. So we can find the inside of building where human cannot access.
Led by Professor of Electrical Engineering Shim Hyun-chul, the Unmanned Systems Research Group at KAIST equips its automated drones with lidar sensors, which shoot laser beams and measure the time it takes for the lights to travel to an object, reflect, and return. They provide the drones with distance perception, despite the lack of GPS satellite signals inside buildings, which prevent ordinary drones from flying properly.
Special system here is this lidar. This is a 2D lidar. It can scan the plane, and we have the computer, because lidar only gives you the surroundings measurement. So you have to do all the complicated mathematical computation using this computer.
Most drones will need someone behind a remote controller, but this 2D lidar drone behind me, developed by KAIST, can move on its own autonomously to deliver a water bottle to its designated location.
In the case of a collapsed building, that designated location could be a room with someone trapped under debris, dehydrated, motionless, and perhaps just minutes away from death.
By sending our unmanned drones or robots to disaster sites first, we can acquire more information on the area without risking any casualties, and then deploy rescue workers later when it's deemed safe to do so.
The application of next-generation drones goes beyond rescue operations, though. Like many other technologies, drones were originally designed for military purposes, reconnaissance, surveillance, and targeted attacks. And the more they are developed, the more they'll be put to such use.
Conventional military combat of old required all soldiers to be physically present in battle, holding their weapons, inevitably leading to casualties. Now, though, warfare is a mix of both conventional and unmanned combat. But in the future, military forces will ultimately see artificial intelligence take command of unmanned weaponry. It can thus be said that drone combat is a game changer, playing the most important role in that transition.
The most tangible change felt by the general public, however, will likely come in the transportation of commercial goods.
On the private front, tech firms like Pablo Air dream of a world where drones can safely and swiftly deliver parcels right to your doorstep.
At Drone Show Korea 2022, the firm set up a diorama depicting an urban center filled with drones flying above and around city buildings, visible through virtual reality headsets. But company executives believe it'll no longer be a virtual reality in a few years.
A lot depends on how aviation laws and other related restrictions loosen up moving forward. But our goal for now is to have a fully functioning drone delivery system by 2025. And in 2025, we're planning to enter the urban air mobility industry with the aim of expanding our business to include air taxi operations.
Drones are quickly becoming a part of our daily lives. My daughter even takes an after-school class on them. I brought her here so she can take an interest in drones along with the 4th and 5th industrial revolutions.
But as one of the founding fathers of drone tech in the country, Professor Shim cautions that it's unrealistic to expect urban air mobility to be readily available just because the science is there.
Any kind of the aviation rulemaking is very, very slow. Not that they are lazy, not that they don't want it, but the aerial mobility involves a lot of the critical safety issues. If the flying thing crashes, the people on board can most likely, suffer a very severe injury or even death. And also the people, innocent people on the ground, can be crushed by it. That's a big, big problem.
The pioneer says at least 10 years will need to pass before flying cars safely roam the skies. But until then, he's all for the gradual integration of drones into every other aspect of human civilization, starting, of course, with unmanned indoor navigation.
I like to challenge the status quo of the technology and also try to address the problem in a little bit different angle. So this indoor, many people think that drone is only flying outdoor. But I thought, why not? Why don't you fly indoor and do the drone racing or use a drone for delivery, all this kind of thing. I did a fight.
한성우, Arirang News, Busan.
Good morning. As much as we would like to see heavy rain to help put out wildfires in eastern coastal regions, we'll have more dry spells across Korea, including here in the capital. Strong wind alerts have been lifted, but still there will be plenty of wind today. Wildfire danger levels are at their highest, so Ulsan, Gyeongsang-Pukto Province and Samcheok in Gangwon-do Province are, of course, on the highest alert, so fire safety precautions are a must. Spring cold will ease this afternoon, a chilly start, but daily highs will go around the season norms, and it's going to get warmer as the week goes on. Morning temperatures are similar to slightly higher than the same time yesterday under partly sunny skies, so there will be big gaps between lows and highs today. Gaps can be 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, and Daegu and Gyeongju could go up to 14 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Highs will jump to the mid-teens by the middle of the week, while dry weather continues across Korea through Saturday. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Tuesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-Gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Thank you as always for joining us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Until next time, goodbye.